Nobody talks about heaven the way they talk about hell. Hell comes with images: fire, darkness, circles, specific torments, geography you can map. You can describe hell. People have been describing it for centuries with remarkable consistency and visual specificity because the institution that built it was careful to make it vivid. The paintings, the sermons, the manuals of instruction for preachers that cataloged, sin by sin, exactly what waited on the other side of disobedience. Hell was architected to be unforgettable. Heaven, by contrast, is almost always described in terms of absence. No more pain, no more death, no more suffering, no more tears. Ask most people what heaven actually looks like, what you actually do there, what it actually feels like on any given eternal afternoon, and the answers become vague almost immediately. Streets of gold, reunions with loved ones, eternal rest. The descriptions thin out quickly, and what fills the space where details should be is a kind of warm, generalized brightness that says very little about what the experience actually is. That asymmetry is not an accident. It is the clearest possible sign that something happened to the idea of heaven somewhere in history. The fear was built out with care and precision. The hope was left deliberately blurry, and blurry hope is much easier to control than a clear vision of something you might recognize if you found it, because a clear vision doesn't need a manager. A blurry one does. This is the history of paradise, and it begins, strangely, not after death, but in a garden. The original vision of paradise in the biblical tradition is not a destination at the end of a good life. It is a description of a beginning. The Garden of Eden is not heaven in the sense of a place reserved for those who have earned it. It is the state of existence. Before separation from God became the defining condition of human life, Adam and Eve did not need to die to be in the presence of the divine. They were already there, walking in the garden in the cool of the day, in intimate, unmediated, daily relationship with God. Not because they had earned it through correct behavior or doctrinal compliance, not because an institution had determined their eligibility, but simply because that was what they were, and where they were, and who they were with. The story of the fall is, in this reading, not primarily a story about sin and punishment. It is a story about separation, about the moment when something that had been immediate and whole and unself-conscious became distant and mediated and anxious, about the first moment of shame, of hiding, of the awareness that you are being looked at, of the impulse to cover yourself because you no longer trust what you are. The rest of the entire biblical narrative, in one fundamental sense, is the story of the long, difficult, and never quite completed journey back toward what was lost in that moment, not toward a new location that you travel to after death, toward a restored relationship that you recover before death through the whole of a lived life. That distinction matters enormously because a restored relationship is something you can begin to experience right now. A location requires you to be somewhere else first, and to have died first, and to have met the right criteria first. The relationship model is immediately available. The destination model is always deferred. The New Testament is far less interested in describing heaven as a place than most of the Christian culture built around it would suggest. When Jesus speaks about what he calls the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, he almost never describes it as a distant destination reserved for after death. He describes it as something already present and already arriving, like a seed growing in the earth that no one can see, but is becoming something real regardless, like leaven hidden in bread, spreading through the whole without anyone directing the process, like a treasure buried in a field that someone stumbles across without looking for it, like a net that catches everything and then sorts, like 10 women waiting with lamps, some of whom are awake and some of whom have fallen asleep. The images are earthy, immediate, surprising. They resist being reduced to a simple address you go to after you die. He says in the Gospel of Luke that the kingdom of God is within you, or among you, depending on how you translate the Greek. Both meanings point in the same direction. Not up and not later, but here, now. inside the texture of present human life, in the relationships and choices and quality of attention that constitute a lived day. He tells the thief crucified beside him, a man who had no time remaining to comply with any institutional requirement, no opportunity for a final sacrament, no moment to demonstrate doctrinal correctness. Today you will be with me in paradise, not eventually, not after a period of purification. Today, he describes what entry into the kingdom actually looks like in terms that consistently surprised his audience and continue to surprise people who read them carefully. The poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers, the pure in heart, not the theologically certified, not the institutionally affiliated, not the ritually compliant and doctrinally clean. The hungry, the ones who had stopped pretending they understood everything and had started paying actual attention. The early Christian communities, gathered in homes and in the catacombs in conditions of genuine uncertainty and danger, shared a vision of what they called the kingdom that was immediate, communal, and present tense. Something happening in their midst right now. Something already transforming their relationships with one another and with the world around them. The resurrection was absolutely central to their hope, and the afterlife was part of the picture. But the kingdom was not primarily a future address. It was a current reality they were participating in, imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely and viscerally. What happened to that vision over the following centuries is one of the most consequential transformations in the history of Western religious thought, and it happened not through a sudden reversal, but through a slow process of gradually centering one reading of the tradition and gradually marginalizing the other, until what had been a living tension became, for most ordinary believers, invisible. The kingdom as present reality did not disappear from the texts. It simply stopped being the center of gravity that most people organized their spiritual lives around. The destination replaced it. The reward replaced the relationship. And the institution that administered the destination replaced the interior life that the relationship required, as Christianity moved from a persecuted minority movement to the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, and then, over subsequent centuries, to the dominant institution of medieval European civilization. The relationship between the institution and the concept of heaven underwent a fundamental shift. Heaven stopped being primarily a description of what was already available through living in a certain way. It became a destination, a reward, a specific place reserved for those who met specific criteria. And crucially, it became a destination with an admission process that the church controlled. This shift happened gradually, without any single moment of deliberate decision. But its internal logic is visible when you follow it closely. An institution that can determine who goes to heaven and who goes to hell holds a fundamentally different kind of authority than one that cannot. An institution that holds the keys to eternal reward, that controls the sacraments that form the pathway to it, and that can excommunicate those who fail to comply, thereby cutting them off from the sacramental pathway entirely, has leverage over human behavior that no secular power in the pre-modern world could approach. It is leverage that does not require a standing army. It does not require a taxation system. It does not require the capacity to monitor anyone's actual behavior in private. It simply requires that people genuinely believe that what happens to them after death depends on whether they maintain their relationship with the institution before death. If they believe that, you have their complete attention for the duration of their lives. The Crusades are perhaps the starkest illustration of what that leverage produced when pushed to its limit. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095, he offered something unprecedented in the history of Christian practice: a plenary indulgence, the complete remission of all sins, and the assurance of direct entry into heaven for those who took up arms and fought to retake Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Dying in the process was not presented as a tragedy to be mourned. It was presented as a direct ticket to paradise. The speech at Clermont, by multiple contemporary accounts, produced an immediate and overwhelming response. People in the crowd began shouting, "God wills it," before the Pope had finished speaking. Thousands of people from across Europe left their homes, their families, their farms, and their livelihoods to march across thousands of miles of unfamiliar territory into an unknown military situation, many of them to die of disease or violence before they reached Jerusalem, because an institution had explicitly promised them that doing so guaranteed their eternal destination. The promise of heaven had been converted into a military recruitment strategy, and it worked with remarkable effectiveness. For 2 centuries, repeated waves of crusaders mobilized under the same theological framework. The assurance that dying in the service of the Church's earthly objectives was a guaranteed pathway to the reward that every Christian had been told was the ultimate purpose of life. This is not the Christianity of the it is the Christianity of the institution, which had by this point entirely swallowed the Christianity of the kingdom. The same logic drove the sale of indulgences, which would become one of the central triggers of the Protestant Reformation 3 centuries later. For a monetary contribution to the Church, a person could purchase a reduction in the time their soul, or the soul of a deceased loved one, spent in purgatory on the way to heaven. The underlying theology was contested even among serious Catholic thinkers at the time. But the practical message that reached ordinary people was straightforward and transactional. The Church could affect your eternal destiny. It was in the business of doing so, and it would do so in exchange for earthly payment. The indulgence preacher, Johann Tetzel, became notorious for a formula so stark it still gets quoted 500 years later. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Whether or not Tetzel actually used those exact words is debated by historians, but the practice he represented was real. Heaven, or rather the improved probability of reaching it on a shorter timeline, had become a purchasable commodity. The most fundamental human hope had acquired a price point, and the question of who qualified for heaven regardless of payment was managed with the same institutional precision as any other resource under Church control. Dying outside the formal membership of the Church, whether through excommunication for theological or political offenses, or through heresy, or simply through the failure to receive the last rites before death, was understood to carry serious and potentially permanent implications for your eternal destination. The final sacraments were not only spiritual comfort for the dying person, they were, in the institutional framework of the era, a kind of boarding pass, and the Church held the only printer. The practical effect on ordinary human life was profound. Your death, the most private and universal of all human experiences, was surrounded by institutional protocol that determined where you went afterward. A priest who arrived in time could open the door. One who didn't arrive in time, or who had reason to withhold the sacrament, could leave it closed. Your family's grief, if you died without the proper rites, was compounded by genuine theological terror about what had become of the person they loved. The institution had extended its authority, not merely over how you lived, but over how your death was processed, and over the eternal consequences of that processing. None of this required the people involved to be acting in bad faith. Many priests who administered last rites genuinely believed that they were providing something essential and irreplaceable. Many bishops who defended the Church's institutional claims over the afterlife genuinely believed those claims were true, and that their defense was a form of service. The point is not that the institution was populated by cynics calculating their leverage. Institutions do not need cynicism to do what this history describes. They need only a structure in which the incentives align in a particular direction, and in which the people within the structure act in ways that perpetuate it, often with complete sincerity. The point is that a set of institutional structures had been built around the most fundamental human hope, the hope that death is not the final word and that something of us continues, in a way that made the institution itself the necessary mediator of that hope. Remove the institution, and the hope was left without its manager, which was, structurally, not a situation the institution had any interest in allowing to develop. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in the early 16th century, was in significant part a revolt against exactly this structure. Martin Luther's original objection was specifically about indulgences, the sale of access to heaven. His central theological recovery was the concept of grace freely given, not purchased, not administered through elaborate institutional protocol, not contingent on the specific sacramental management of the Church hierarchy. Heaven, in the theology that emerged from the Reformation, was restored to its character as gift, not commodity. But even in the traditions that rejected indulgences and sacramental gifts, the destination model itself remained intact. Heaven was still primarily a place you went after death, if you believed and lived correctly. The argument was about who had legitimate authority to manage the pathway. It was not generally an argument about whether the pathway model, heaven as a future destination earned through correct belief and behavior, was the most spiritually accurate description of what the concept was originally pointing at. That argument was being made, but not in the mainline theological debates. It was being made in the mystical traditions that had run alongside official Christianity for centuries, without ever quite fitting inside it. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century German mystic and theologian, was tried for heresy, partly because of statements that could be read to suggest that the soul's union with God was available now, in this life, not reserved for an afterlife destination. He spoke of a spark in the soul, a ground of the soul, something in the human being that was never fully separated from the divine, even while alive in the body. He said that God is at home in the soul, and the soul at home in God, in terms that implied no death was required to achieve this. The institutional church found this threatening enough to pursue him legally. Teresa of Avila, writing in the 16th century, described the interior life of prayer as a journey through interior castles, each drawing the soul closer to the divine center at its core. What she was describing was an architecture of paradise that existed inside a living human being, not at a destination after death, but accessible through prayer, through attention, through the willingness to move through the difficulty of inner transformation while still alive. These voices were not inventing something new. They were recovering something old. They were finding their way back to the understanding that had been present before the institutional apparatus of heaven had been built. That paradise is not primarily a place you are trying to earn admission to after death, but a state of being that the human soul can begin to approach in the present life through the quality of its relationship with the divine. That the real spiritual work is not qualification. It is return, not earning the right to enter somewhere, clearing away enough of the accumulated noise, fear, and false certainty to notice that you were never as far from where you were trying to go as you had been taught to believe. Here is what the whole arc of this history actually reveals. There are two fundamentally different understandings of what heaven or paradise or the kingdom of God actually is, and they have been in tension with each other across the entire span of Christian history. The first is heaven as a future location, a reward distributed after death to those who met the criteria established by a legitimate authority and maintained their relationship with the institution authorized to manage the process. This version requires institutions. It requires gatekeepers. It requires criteria of admission. It requires the threat of its opposite to make it compelling, and it generates extraordinary compliance from the people who believe in it, because the stakes, literally eternal, could not possibly be higher. The second is heaven. It requires attention, not compliance. It requires the willingness to turn inward, rather than looking outward to an authority that will certify your eligibility. These two versions have coexisted for centuries, sometimes within the same institution, sometimes in explicit theological conflict, sometimes simply as a persistent tension that the institution chose to manage by emphasizing one and minimizing the other. And the pattern of emphasis is not hard to identify. That has always been available, that was the original condition of the garden before separation, and that the entire spiritual life is oriented toward recovering. This version requires practice, not permission. The version that requires institutional mediation was consistently amplified, taught from pulpits, enforced through canon law, dramatized in art, sold in various forms, and defended with legal force when questioned. The version that required only attention and relationship was consistently present in the mystical literature, but it was also consistently marginalized, suspected, and in specific cases prosecuted. Because here is the thing about the version of paradise that the mystics described. It makes no institutional gatekeeping possible. You cannot sell access to a state of being that is already present in every human soul. You cannot require specific sacraments as a prerequisite for something already woven into the fabric of what you are. You cannot excommunicate someone from their own interior life. You cannot threaten someone with the loss of their access to God when God, in this understanding, was never absent. That version of paradise is available to anyone, regardless of institutional affiliation, regardless of historical era, regardless of the specific sacramental history of the person sitting in front of you, which is precisely why the version of heaven that the institutions of power consistently chose to emphasize was the other one. If what Jesus said is true, that the kingdom of God is within you, then heaven is not primarily a place you are trying to earn admission to. It is a state you are trying to remember how to inhabit. Not after you die, not after you comply with the right set of requirements. Now, in the actual texture of your living, breathing, daily existence. The mystics across every century and every tradition have been pointing at this with remarkable consistency. The goal of the spiritual life, in their account, was not to qualify for a destination. It was to recover a relationship, to return to an intimacy with the divine that was always present but had become covered over, obscured, forgotten, pushed aside by the noise and urgency and fear of ordinary life. Not to earn paradise, to remember that you were never as far from it as you had been taught to believe. That recognition, the history of paradise, honestly read, is the history of that recognition being repeatedly obscured by institutions that needed the destination model to survive, and repeatedly recovered by individuals who went deep enough into their own interior life to find something that no institution had put there. The recognition that the divine is not located somewhere inaccessible and far away, but woven through the fabric of what you already are, is the beginning of what every genuine spiritual tradition, beneath its doctrinal surface, has always been trying to cultivate. Not the work of qualifying, the work of returning, not proving you are good enough to enter, clearing away enough of the noise and fear and false self to notice that the door was never locked. If something in this history resonates with you, if the idea of reconnecting with that interior presence, with the part of you that was never fully separated from the divine in the first place, feels like the actual spiritual work you want to do, that is precisely the territory. The ebook, Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, was written to walk through with you, not as a theology to be accepted or rejected, as a companion for the interior journey back toward what the garden was always pointing at. The link is in the description. And the question that closes this particular chapter of history: if paradise was never primarily a destination to be earned and awarded after death, but a relationship to be recovered and lived into starting now, what changes about how you move through the world today? Not after you have satisfied every requirement, not once you have proven yourself worthy to the right authority, not after death, when the result of your life's audit is finally announced. Today, the garden has always been closer than the theologians of power wanted you to believe, and the door into it has never been held by anyone but you.